Good morning, everyone. Thanks for coming today to the start of our public programs in regard to Yayoi Kusama and her exhibition, Life is the Heart of a Rainbow. Before we start, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we're meeting today, past and present. I'm Zara Stanhope, Curatorial Manager of Asian and Pacific Art at the Gallery, and it's my great pleasure today here to really be hosting two of the three exhibition curators of the exhibition. On my left here, Adele Tan from Singapore Art Museum, and on the far left, Ruben Kehan, curator at QAGOMA here, and a curator who's had a long association, as they both have with Kusama's work. So today, Adele and Ruben are going to give us some of the insights into the behind-the-scene processes of putting the exhibition together, their research and their thoughts also about this artist's work, and how I think we have here a very special exhibition that both honours and celebrates Kusama's work at this point in her very, very long career. I thought we'd start off with some sort of prompts or questions from me, then we will open up to the floor so that if you have questions that you'd also like to ask the curators, we'll be able to pass around a microphone so that you'll be able to be well heard across the room. Just an open question to both of you in terms of your process of putting the exhibition together. What were your curatorial aims for the exhibition, and did you have separate individual goals for this exhibition, and how did you bring them together as a curatorial team?
Maybe I could kick off, because the first exhibition was at the National Gallery, Singapore. Some of you might know of it, but it's a fairly new institution in Singapore looking at modern and also contemporary art of Southeast Asia. So to present an Asian artist and devote a kind of a monographical exhibition quite early on, at its opening, that's kind of considered quite unprecedented. So we also had to consider this positioning ourselves, but we were thinking along the lines that Kusama, being quite a major pivotal figure in the art history of the 20th century, was kind of the perfect artist to introduce a lot of the significant art movements to the audiences in Singapore and Southeast Asia. And she, of course, is the artist of the moment, having been proclaimed recently as the world's most popular artist. And I think we're also, riding that crest as a museum. But also we were wanting to deepen that relationship, or familiarity with Kusama herself. She was already present at the Singapore Biennale before. Some of you might have seen images of the trees on Orchard Road being wrapped in this polka-dotted fabric. Yeah, so that's probably the most enduring image of the artist and the audience's memories, the polka dots. But she's got a vast lifetime of production, 7 decades of work, that now we wanted to be sure that we introduce that properly to the audiences in an art historical, intellectual way, but also definitely accessible and engaging. Yeah.
Thanks, Adele.
For us, it was a couple of things. The Queensland Art Gallery's relationship with the artist obviously goes back quite a long way. So we've spoken quite a bit about having included a work by her in the 1989 exhibition, Japanese Ways, Western Means, which was a survey of Japanese art in the 1980s, co-organised with the Museum of Modern Art in Saitama Prefecture as part of a sister state agreement. And then subsequently beginning to collect her work in the 90s, featuring her quite in depth in the 4th Asia Pacific Triennial. And then when I came into the gallery at the start of 2011, one of the first things that I was engaged in was producing a solo exhibition by Kusama, Look Now, See Forever, which focused exclusively on the work that she was producing at that time. So this exhibition was an opportunity to perhaps look in more in depth at the history of her practice, and in particular to show some of the kinds of work that we hadn't shown before. And the opportunity to collaborate with the National Gallery Singapore, partly out of necessity, given the huge demand for loans of Kusama's work, because there are so many shows circulating at the moment, because she is such an in-demand artist, it was really quite useful for us to combine forces, given that we were looking at doing a show at the same time. But also, as Adele mentioned, I guess contextualizing Kusama's practice within that greater narrative of the multiple modernisms, I suppose, that were operative or have been operative within Asia and in Southeast Asia in particular, from the 19th century until now. Kusama's trajectory, I think, is a very interesting one as an artist who's moved between various contexts. And in some ways, she's emblematic, I think, of the non-linear nature of a lot of the modernisms that we see outside of the Western modernist canon. So I think that was an interesting way to look at her work as well.
We might come back to that, thinking about the bigger art historical context, just focusing on the artist and Kusama in the studio, which we often see photographs of her over time in Japan. Can you say a little bit about her working process, or maybe your insights in terms of working with Kusama and her studio?
Well, I think Ruben's had far more visits than I have to Kusama's studio, but it was quite a revelation in terms of me, because I had expected a much larger studio production.
Yes.
But actually it's quite a slight team, very tight, maybe about 10 in the office. And we also had a kind of privileged preview of the new Kusama Museum when I was there last year. But she is an artist who is pretty much, I would say, industrious. She gets up to paint every day. There's a kind of personal relationship with it, rather than it being kind of in different factory pushing, artworks out. She does definitely have assistants who will hand her paints and stuff. But because she's been doing it for so many years, there's a kind of almost automatism that comes out of her work. Some people have called it also muscle memory. Yeah. That she's been doing it since, her teens. Yeah. And therefore that continuity and that energy just comes in out on the canvases. And there is a film that is going to be shown in relation to the exhibition. It's got cheeky title, I Adore Myself, Yayoi Kusama. But it really shows you the kinds of behind the scenes of how she actually works, and in particular the Love Forever series that is on show in this exhibition.
Great.
Yeah, I think that's the thing. She is very hands-on at a time when there are artists with mega studios now in multiple cities employing literally hundreds of staff. As Adele said, it's a very tight team. It's a team with a pretty clear division of labour as well. So a lot of the support actually is administrative. And in kind of handling the vast amount of correspondence that sort of comes through to the studio at the moment. But physically, her main preoccupation is painting at the moment, has been for some time. And the only real assistance that she has with that, of course, is stretching the canvases and priming them, laying a ground colour, and as Adele said, sort of providing the paints to the artist. But it's all her hand, all of that work. The sheer amount of time that she puts into the work is quite phenomenal. She's always done that as an artist, and it's one of the reasons that her oeuvre is so vast and varied.
Yeah, I have to also acknowledge the work of the studio in terms of the preparation of the exhibition. We had tremendous amounts of correspondence and also a great deal of discussion with the studio members, including also Ota Fine Arts. So it's really felt like a collaboration, not just between QAGOMA and NGS, but also with Kusama Studios.
Yeah.
Yeah, and the artist passes a lot of the correspondence. She actually reads through the proposals that are sent through. So it's not that, she's an artist ensconced away in her own production, but she really is, has dedicated a lot of time poring over the exhibition details. Yeah.
Yeah, so she's obviously very concerned about the presence of her work and the presentation of her work and career now, into her 80th year. So it's a fairly phenomenal career and practice.
Yeah. And I think her level of quality control, I guess I'd call it, is really high. Not just anyone can put the dots out on, So there are trained studio assistants who come out to do that. Even if we're producing any kind of marketing material that includes the dots, it needs to be sent to the studio, and the dots will often be rearranged by her assistants in consultation with the artist to get it just right. So she's involved in everything. Yeah.
Yeah, that's also kind of a hands-on approach to a lot of things. Even the polka dots that you from afar look like it's been machine printed. A lot of them are also stickers that have to be manually adhered to either the walls or even the balloons.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of handwork and teamwork amongst the studio members to get that through. Yeah.
In terms of the exhibition, you've brought together a great range of works, from very early work through to her current painting series produced in silkscreen for exhibition purposes, and covering the infinity knots, fields, obliteration works, mirror rooms as well. It really does represent many streams of her practice. Are there sort of key works that you really hope that the audience identify as sort of signifying various stages or important parts of her practice in the exhibition?
Well, I mean, for me, from the outset, I was very keen on two particular bodies of work. One was the large Dots Obsession inflatables in Gallery 1.2, in the long gallery here, partly because we have these very lofty spaces here at the gallery that I have, since I started here, wanted to fill with Kusama's inflatables. The second was the soft sculpture and her engagement with the sort of very organic biomorphic forms, often on ways bordering on the abject, that we weren't sort of able to include really in her last exhibition, and to look at the continuity that they enable between the very early phase of her practice, which is working at a much smaller scale, and the more recent work. So looking at the continuity even to the Dots Obsession inflatables in terms of their colour schemes, where did those colours come from, and how have they operated in her practice over time?
Yeah, I also want to mention Narcissus Garden, which at the moment is a bit away from the main exhibition hall. Yeah. But for us, when we did it in Singapore, it was the kind of finale work, as to kind of also not just kind of ending the show with a bang, but it's a work that brings in the past and also the present and, perhaps the future even. Because it's a work that it inaugurated in 1966 at the Venice Biennale, and then recently represented in a quite different way at the Yokohama Triennale, was then put on water, and subsequently now in this more recent incarnations that you see it. But it also suitors into the installation, the performative elements that were present in the 60s in her practice. Yeah, so in that one work, we could talk about her practice over the years.
Yes. And that work is over at Queensland Art Gallery building, the 70s building in the Water Mall area, and many of you know it, big silver balls that move around with the flow of the water. So in a sense you get these multiple, almost infinite different views of people, the space, the light as well. So it's ever-changing and dynamic. And as Adele said, in Venice in 1966, Kusama presented this work as a sort of intervention. It wasn't a formal inclusion in the Biennale, and also encouraged people to take a ball away. We don't want visitors here to do that, please. But this is, it's a more formal...
Well, she sold it for $2 each.
Yeah.
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 pretty much an author giveaway. It's much more an institutionalised piece now, but as Adele said, this performative element has been really key in Kusama's practice, particularly starting in the 60s when she was in New York, and you've included a wonderful room of photographs and moving image works in the exhibition, which give us a taste of this, and her work also with garments and fashion and the event nature of her work. And I think that's really special. It'd be great if you could say something about the inclusion of that group of works or documentation.
Well, in the National Gallery exhibition, it was quite a considered effort to use that period as a kind of a pivot. So it was situated in the middle gallery. So the first gallery would talk about iconic motifs, certainly the infinity net paintings that you see out there. And in the middle section, we wanted to go more towards the body, how she represents herself, or talks about different parts of the body with the soft sculptures and phalluses, and also the immersive qualities of her installations in the mirror room. So that middle section was really, all about the physical, sensorial nature of her work. And the performances were definitely very key to that, and we were quite fortunate to be able to gather some quite amazing archival images. So the documentary self-obliteration, and then the walking piece as well. So, but of course the sensitive, well, I wouldn't consider it that sensitive, but because of the laws of our, countries, we had to create a distinct section to protect young eyes from the work. But I think it also managed to kind of slow people down, that they had to enter this other space, like an anteroom, and actually to stop and then reconsider her practice somewhat.
The idea of the body is really one of the key themes of the show. And it's interesting to see the various ways it's manifested. Firstly, of course, in the performances, which are where it's sort of pictured, it's kind of quite obvious. But then in those 1970s and 80s, early 90s works, where she's working with these kind of more biomorphic forms, where the body becomes a site of both terror and wonder as a sort of a source that she's drawing on in a way that I think approaches the surrealism of that she was sort of touched on in her earlier practice. And then finally, the way that it's the body of the viewer, I guess, that sort of becomes quite central to the experience of the installations. And those art historical anchors start to become really interesting. So even looking back at her relationship to minimalism in that regard, which she, I guess it was a contemporary of, before it was called minimalism, in New York in the very, very early 1960s. But thinking through this idea of the artwork as an object that's experienced as a kind of a Gestalt sensation, a kind of a total phenomenal apprehension of the work of art rather than a simple visual experience. To think about the way that we sort of move through the space, which I think deepens or enriches or provides alternative readings to the purely visual representation that circulates very widely of Kusama these days. So we're aware of the reproduction of her as images of her installations that people now take and circulate on social media. But there are other experiences that one has of those works. So to be able to really multiply those potential readings was something that we were interested in doing.
Yeah, and one more thing I'd like to add was that particular section, I think, was also useful in showing that Kusama was also part of a scene, although she has been said to work in large parts in isolation, but she was definitely part of an avant-garde scene in the 60s, and she was traveling between New York and Europe, and definitely showing in shows. She was, I think, most connected to the Zero and Null groups in Germany and Holland. So we wanted to acknowledge that relationship with these archival images. I
think that's probably a really distinctive part of this exhibition as well. And you both were sort of touching on the multiple readings of her works, which I think come across very strongly, particularly if you sort of re-enter the exhibition or you've seen Kusama's works a few times. There's this sense of a sort of fecund nature, lots of pumpkins, lots of writhing forms, sometimes look like tentacles. There's fields that could be cosmoses, or they could be something very micro at the same time. There's this huge energy also in a lot of those works. Even that sense of infinity, it's really abundant. It's not like a void of nothingness. It's filled up all the time with something that she places in those rooms. Yet at the same time, she talks a lot about her work being the purpose of obliterating the ego, in a sense, almost like losing oneself, obviously, within it. Do you see these things sort of working in tension, like this great amount of manifestation of form, in a sense, and the sense of the self disappearing? Or do you think that these things sit very well together in terms of her work and the different types of work that we see in this exhibition?
It's tricky. I think she does have this quite extraordinary artistic vocabulary that's become associated with interpretations of her work. So words like infinity, obsession, obliteration, aggregation, accumulation, repetition, these words that sort of figure again and again that she's used throughout her practice. Sometimes they're really well defined, and sometimes they're less defined. So it's very hard to actually come to a very sort of a strong sense of what a contradiction between those terms might be. It's more that they sort of function poetically, I think, and that they do function, I think, as an articulation of her grappling to understand what the process of art making means to her and what her belief in the transformative power of art is. So these kind of concepts of infinity and obliteration are often sort of come back to the idea of the ego and this funny, ambiguous role that her identity sort of plays in relationship to her work.
But I also kind of appreciate that tension that exists in her oeuvre and also in her own makeup, and it allows us to imbue these multiple meanings every time we revisit her work. The polka dot can be a singular instance. But as she says, the polka dots coming together, and the agglomeration of them, and which is just why one dot becomes polka dots. It also augurs or points to sociality, people coming together, and then the stars in the cosmos. You can, infinitely kind of multiply the ambit of Kusama, and it is. I think it also, in some ways, informed the way we curated the show in Singapore, in a sense that in the first galleries, we had the Infinity Nets and then My Eternal Soul in the third gallery, and sort of bookends, but these are series that don't end. So she has continued to paint Infinity Nets, something that she started from the 50s, hasn't stopped, and it doesn't seem like she's stopping with My Eternal Soul as well. Yeah, so these are chains of repetition that keep continuing and pulsating.
I kind of like the way that she confuses that linear notion of an artist's development by returning to much earlier modes of making and retrieving them. Some modes of working she'll leave dormant for some time and then revisit them. Older works will be revisited and recreated. We have 2 recreations or revisitings of earlier works in this exhibition as examples of that. And I like this kind of, you can lay down a timeline of her life, but it's often difficult to illustrate that with her practice as a very strict linear development.
It's almost like the loops that you see in the Infinity Nets from the early period.
Although there is a freshness, if you what we might call the final room in the exhibition, which is where you're completely surrounded really by the My Eternal Soul series of works, the paintings, the silk screens on the wall. They seem to have a really fresh liveliness about them at the same time as they are still using, in a formal sense, dotting if you get up quite close to them. And the way that Kusama works is perhaps changing over time as well. But it seems to be that although there's some continuity there, there's still innovation and there's still freshness, even in this ongoing series, which is now, I think, over 500 of those works, which we've got a selection of here. Yeah. And also perhaps, looking at a different sense of contemporary society that Kusama's working in at the moment. But maybe just to flick to something slightly different. When Kusama left America and went back to Japan in the early 1970s, she also started to be quite a prolific writer. And maybe that was a part of a sort of self-reflection process as well. But I think she produced something like 15 books and an autobiography over quite some period there. Have you got any sense of how the writing relates to the art practice? Because, it seems very much art is her life, so the writings are presumably tied very much into her production of her visual work as well.
I mean, it's it's an activity that she really kind of absorbed herself in, partly for a number of historical reasons. One, the move back to Japan was both a difficult and a liberating thing for Kusama. On the one hand, she was already feeling that she'd been marginalised by the American art world as, after about 1964, this hegemony of the white male genius artist was very strongly kind of reconstructed. And a lot of women and artists of colour were written out of history for a time. But at the same time, unlike a contemporary like Yoko Ono, who had moved regularly between Japan and the United States and been very firmly involved in the Japanese avant-garde, Kusama had really left the scene entirely, and so when she came back, she found it quite difficult to adjust in terms of her own practice. But she's sort of spoken about the fact that she didn't feel that she had to compete anymore. That living in New York had actually been quite a stressful time for her because of just how competitive the art world is there, that she had more time to pursue things like writing and poetry. And really, there was a time in the late 1970s and early 1980s where in Japan, Kusama was better known as a writer than she was as a visual artist. And certainly through the 1980s, actually her closest associates were writers like Ryu Murakami or Kenji Nakagami, writers who were dealing with some of the kind of darker aspects of the human psyche or of Japanese society. And probably the closest friend that she had as a visual artist was Araki, the photographer. Again, whose work deals with issues that perhaps were quite taboo at a certain time. So that really inflected the visual work that she was producing as well. So there is a poetic richness and there is this exploration of perhaps a lot more darker elements, but there's a wonderful playfulness to it as well.
Just like her work in that sense.
Yeah, no, the poetry also is sometimes approaches lyrics to songs.
Yes.
She started also writing ditties and she had a piano and she was composing tunes. And also to remember that a lot of her work also has an oral aspect. And in the initial peep rooms that she installed, there was also that mechanization of sound. She'd be playing music with it. So it kind of fits into this kind of a holistic approach to art.
Yeah, so there's this kind of, there's this exploration from the late 1960s of multimedia. She's working with psychedelic bands for these live happenings, producing visual material for, these musical events. And that multimedia exploration, I think, becomes sublimated in her later practice. So when she starts returning with real dedication to producing visual art, and it should be said that she, it's really funny, she doesn't write at the moment, and she doesn't like her books being talked about. She wants people to talk about her current work, I suppose as any artist does.
Yeah.
But that I think a lot of the areas that she investigated through various media have sort of come back to her work and have really strengthened it. And I think you can say the same for the various different art movements that she sort of touched on but never really been a part of. So the way that the current work combines elements that you might associate with pop, with minimalism, with psychedelia, with surrealism, but it's none of those things as well as being all of them at once.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting sort of zone of her practice where there's a lot more probably to be explored in the future. Just perhaps before we open it up for some questions, one of the aspects with Kusama that is sort of ever present, but we haven't really touched on, is the body. You did mention it before, Adele, and whether it's sort of our body that we see mirrored in the infinity rooms, or whether it's a sort of representation of body elements and body parts in her work as well, or the artist herself. It's an ever-present sort of form, really, in her work in many ways. And, of course, it's a privileging of the female body over the male body in a sense of how she also talks about her work and her experience. And this, I mean, it's present in the show, but it's not something that you've, in a sense, very much highlighted in a way. I mean, it's there, but it's not something that in other shows of Kusama's work you often see a lot more, a lot more Farley and the sort of three-dimensional works which reference the body. Was that a conscious decision to really sort of look at the use of the body, perhaps through more documentation and through the works themselves, in a way that didn't perhaps over-privilege that aspect of her work?
I think if given an opportunity, would have, really wanted a, early kind of phallic self-sculpture work from the 60s. But that didn't quite present itself. But we were still lucky enough to get that mannequin.
67.
From 67. But I also want to say that, the body is quite a vexatious thing. And in fact, the making of the self-sculptures, the phalluses, was her way to control her, her phobic reactions. So I think that measure of control kind of continues, although it's, the protuberance is just kind of overrun the space and her imagination. So that relationship with the body, I think, moves between these two poles, going kind of crazy, but at the same time really controlled. So even down to her presentation of herself in, dress, dressing up in the kimono, and certainly performing as well with that. And then lately to her more recognizable kind of red wig that she puts on. It's a kind of a iconic kind of a presentation of Kusama now. Yeah, so that body is moving through different modes all the time. It's also kind of like us, reflected. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. We sort of talked about the relationship to feminism of Kusama's practice, and there are certain statements that she's made that the origin of the kind of the phalli and the multiplied phalli in particular, phalli that kind of covered everything, was in some earlier statements a direct response to a highly patriarchal structure to the art world at the time. That she felt that there was this kind of assertion of phalli everywhere, so in a way she was kind of, there were phalluses kind of operating everywhere in male behaviour, and that she was kind of fighting back against that. Her own interpretations of those works have shifted over time, and I think as they do for any artist who's been making work for a long period of time, the phallic aspect is perhaps de-emphasised now in discussion of her work. But I think that the role of eroticism within her practice, her very kind of conscious articulation and presentation of her own presence as a potentially erotic object. I think in the earlier phase of her practice is very interesting, right through to the picturing of women in works that border on the abstract. So in Love Forever, the black and white series, for example, these faces in profile that are always women within the title, and they have this kind of femininity to them. So that it's certainly interesting, and I think it's a ground for a lot more study and research, and there's probably another show in that, actually.
Yeah. We'll look forward to that one. Have we got any questions for Adele or Ruben?
Thank you. I just found that really fascinating, like 7 decades of work, and you were locating it in place of the avant-garde in Europe in the 60s and the 60s in New York, and yet she was non-linear and also not really part of the cultural hegemony of that time. And it just made me think about, I spent a bit of time in Japan, the role and the reception of the artist, especially now that she has this legacy of 70 years' work. You know, Japan is a place where I saw Robert Mapplethorpe on the top of a supermarket department store, and art is popular culture. It's almost rock star status in a way. There's a kind of aesthetic sensibility in Japan that I don't think you would find elsewhere. I mean, I guess there's Andy Warhol and celebrity and popular culture from the 60s, but I'm just wondering, how do you see her role now and her reception in Japan compared to, I guess these maybe are just like the West, I hate to say East-West, but how does her reception and role as an artist in Japan compare to the rest of the world? Is she recognised equally now? Has she become established now, or like more popular, or was she more popular and even like in popular culture in Japan now?
I mean, she's certainly more popular. I mean, it's interesting. I sort of cover this a bit in my catalogue essay, but for a while there, when Kusama came back into the public eye around the end of the 1980s and early 1990s, there were 2 different readings of her practice that were really based on where people were looking from. So in the United States, the fascination was with her historical work. Whereas in Japan, she was seen as very much a contemporary artist, and that's really because of where the timeframes that she was operating in each of those different contexts. That started to shift in the very late 90s and has shifted through the course of the 2000s, so that the narrative we get now of Kusama's practice is a fairly integrated one. But I do think, even if you look at the kinds of exhibitions, Kusama exhibitions that are mounted in Japan and the way that they differ from what we see elsewhere, there still is a pronounced difference. And I think you get a lot more of that kind of mid-period work in the Japanese shows, and you get a lot of the very, very early work before her departure to the United States in 1957, when she was not a part of, but closely related to the Surrealist movement, which was resurgent in Japan at that time, and certainly did circulate with and was supported by a number of key figures within Japanese Surrealism. So there's perhaps there's a slightly different understanding of the background of her practice. But, I also have to say that, when you would have seen that Mapplethorpe show in a department store exhibition, it was really kind of during the heyday of a particular kind of Japanese art scene, when the country was actually a lot more perhaps liberal in terms of its acceptance of certain kinds of practice than it is now. So certainly an artist like Araki, who was close to Kusama in the 80s, has commented on the fact that some of the works that he made at the time he couldn't make now. So there's, it's a shifting interpretation is what I have to say, what I suppose I would say. But of course, the Japanese are incredibly proud of Kusama. She was awarded the highest honour by the emperor last year. So she's very much seen as a major figure now within Japanese culture by Japan itself.
Hi, thanks both. That was really great. I just have a question about the biographical and psychological dimensions of Kusama's practice in relation to that kind of art historical narrative that you've sketched out. Of course, she's one of the only artists who works of her calibre from a voluntary committed position in a psychological institution, and a lot of the motivations for her early work were based on oral and visual hallucinations, you know, pumpkins talking to her and actually seeing visions of those spots. How does that intensely personal, biographical, psychological element of her practice fit with some of the more art historical dimensions of, you know, hanging out with Donald Judd, talking to Georgia O'Keeffe, the way that the forms might be shared but the motivations are different?
I mean, I guess the discussion of the hallucinations is something that only really enters her self-interpretations in the late 1970s. So when she was in New York, she wasn't really promoting that kind of reading of her work. It was, you know, pursued along fairly sort of steady formalist language that was then quite dominant in the US. She did become in the late 1960s quite interested, and she had been interested, I should say, in psychological readings of her work from the 1950s, but perhaps not so much from a really determinist perspective. And then, of course, in the 60s, like a lot of artists, she became interested in a certain language of psychoanalysis that was quite predominant at the time. It's always, I think, an unstable framework for interpreting a work of art to talk about mental illness as generative. It's certainly an important context, I think, for the production of her work. I do worry that we sometimes run the risk of fetishizing it in relation to her practice as another mode of genius, in a way. But I think she's also at the same time a very inspiring figure as somebody who has struggled with a number of these issues, but has made sure that they've been no obstacle to her pursuing a particular vision.
I think that was, the most challenging aspect of the show, which is not to get the biographical element to run away with it all.
Yeah.
But certainly at the same time, we don't want to evade that aspect.
Yeah.
It comes up a lot. You know, all the media questions want to know how does the psychological situation relate to her work. But she's also gradually transformed into a celebrity. So the types of questions that are beginning to be asked about her tend to be about her personal domain. And then you kind of feel like you're moving too far away from the artwork itself. So we want to use the biographical aspect as only one set of, like a lever to open up the work, but then allow the formal aspects of the work to continue the conversation as well. So we wanted to look at the show in terms of the inventiveness that she brings to the artistic language, and also how she would be using these and deploying this in other metaphorical ways, or even as an intellectual enterprise. Yeah.
I was struck when I went into the show, some of the visual language suggested Western desert art and Pitjantjatjara work, and I wondered, is that a universality about expression? Even the work on the cover of the catalogue reminded me of Ruby's work from Pitjantjatjara, and I thought, wouldn't it be wonderful to have those upstairs?
Yeah. I mean, there are very strong formal correspondences that I would hazard to guess stem from the way that the work is actually produced. That she works on a flat canvas, so one that's lying down, and that she works in a, I mean, I wouldn't call it a completely spontaneous way, but there is a spontaneity to her work, but without a really kind of a preconceived plan about what she's coming to, and so that there are some correspondences, I think, with the kind of very at a physical level in terms of the way that those works are made. As to universality, I think the works probably come from very different places, but there is an interesting dialogue, I think, that could be created, perhaps by looking at works in relationship to each other, and also there is significance within a particular form of social life and of storytelling.
I think there have been really great questions sort of touching on our interpretations of contemporary art practice as well, from particularly across this region, or east and west, and our interpretations, our art historical interpretations as well. And I think it's fantastic, as someone who's newly arrived at QAGOMA, that we're having cooperative relationships in putting exhibitions together from Australia outwards into Asia, and working with Adele has been a great pleasure here in terms of your first having the exhibition in Singapore and now here, and I think this is, a great collaborative way to be starting to rethink art histories, and particularly from our regions down here in the south. So I don't think we've got any more questions. So can you really join me in thanking Adele and Ruben both for curating the exhibition and today?